supply chain friction over the course of the last few months. They were one of the bright spots in the landscape, suggesting that the supply chain was going to ease. So anything that would suggest something to the contrary is naturally going to affect them. And this was a surprise. The market wasn't expecting this. We were expecting quite the contrary for Apple specifically.
And it's a reminder that the pandemic is still here.
It is. Another reminder is what's happening to shares of companies that have exposure to Macau. Las Vegas Sands being chief among them. Shares finishing the day down 11.9%. 68.4% of revenue in 2021 for Las Vegas Sands came from Macau, but those U.S.-listed casino operators who do business in Macau under pressure today after those additional COVID-19 restrictions in China stand to curb visitation. And then Tencent finishing the day down just about 9% after the Wall Street Journal reported that it faces a record fine for violating Chinese anti-money laundering regulations. This does also come after J.P. Morgan Chase, or following that, I should say, J.P. Morgan Chase analysts on Monday downgraded 28 China stocks listed in the U.S. and Hong Kong. Among those was Tencent.
Yeah, certainly. I know for our radio audience, typically we do our GRR function. Caroline Hyde does it better than anyone else, so we skip it, that GMM function, and go to yields. And you guys, this is a big day. This was a big movement that we saw in yields. I mentioned this earlier on the 10-year yield, the biggest one-day increase in yield higher that we've seen since March of 2020. The 2-year yield, though, Carol, and this is interesting, it's only the 4th biggest day this year in terms of yield higher. We've had way bigger moves higher as you think about the volatility approaching the Federal Reserve, how you're thinking about the pull forward and some of the inflationary expectations that are confronting this Federal Reserve.
And I guess what I wonder, and let's talk about it, right? The big thing this week is the FOMC meeting, certainly here in the United States, and what the Fed ultimately says. Are they more hawkish? Are they more dovish? You know, are they very careful in how they lay things out? And I do wonder whether or not, in terms of the yields, that we look at the yield curve, is this kind of it? Is this the levels that the market settles it within remain?
Well, you do wonder. I mean, we had those headlines a little bit earlier today about Fed swaps pricing in a full 7 hikes, 25 basis points hikes for 2022. But I would actually turn your question over to Gina right now, particularly when it comes to the inversion and what we should expect.
Yeah, I think that it's a key question. Obviously, the 10s, 2s are dangerously close. The market is looking well ahead into 2023 and saying we are going to eventually price for recession coming. But the Fed does follow that 3-month 10-year Treasury yield for a reason. It's the most reliable indicator of recession. It tends to give you a much more timely indication of recession. And so what the Fed does here is really critical. You know, what I'm watching this week also is the PPI and retail sales numbers tomorrow. I think they could be pretty consequential for getting a beat on how the consumer is contending with inflation and also just how much margin pressure is yet to come.
And you were saying, Gina, earlier, some of the big run-ups in PPI relative to CPI. PPI, though, does it look like it has peaked? Are we starting to see a deceleration or maybe a slower acceleration on at least some of the month-over-month figures? And does that have any correlation to the CPI data in months to come?
It should, if it peaks. I think that's a big if right now because we've seen oil prices surge. Ag prices across the spectrum have surged. Metal prices, obviously, off the charts. So will we really see that peak is a big question. The market is expecting 9%. Could we have more than 9%?
Wow.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that brings us, of course, to Wednesday, and when we do hear from Fed Chair Jay Powell, and I wonder what his, his messaging around inflation is going to be. It certainly moved away from the idea that it's temporary, but again, it was based before on demand shocks, not on supply shocks, like we're seeing right now.
Yes. So a lot for the Fed. I'm curious to see if the markets calm down ahead of the Fed meeting tomorrow and just kind of mark some time, but we shall certainly see. All right, guys, that's got to do it. That's a wrap for our cross-platform coverage on radio, TV, and YouTube. It is called Beyond the Bell, and we will see you again, same time, same place tomorrow.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Massar and Bloomberg Quick Takes Tim Stenovic on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, we are thanks to our TV colleagues, Romaine and, of course, Taylor and Gina. But I just want to mention Vail Resorts down about 5% in the after hours, coming out with its latest earnings update. And it looks like revenue was light. It looks like second quarter EPS was light. And it also looks like its forecast might be a little light as well.
That new CEO who took over for Rob Katz, Kirsten Lynch, certainly has her work cut out for her. The last few months have also seen a slate of news articles in many publications about the lines at many of its resorts around the United States as a result of them lowering the price of the Epic Pass, and to what extent it becomes too much of a chore to actually ski in some of these areas.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Stock's down about 26%. That was as of regular close today, but right now I'm looking in the after hours down about 5%. All right, you are listening to Bloomberg Business Week on Bloomberg Radio. Let's head over to D.C. and Nancy Lyons for World and National News.
Thanks, Carol. The White House is said to be considering the possibility of President Biden traveling to Europe in the coming weeks for face-to-face talks with European leaders. Well, as Biden thinks about heading overseas, Ukraine's president is bringing his appeal to the U.S.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky will deliver a virtual address to Congress on Wednesday. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer sent a joint letter to lawmakers saying that Zelensky will address House and Senate lawmakers virtually as the Russian war on his country intensifies. All lawmakers are invited to the talk, which will be delivered via video at the Capitol. Zelensky spoke by video with lawmakers earlier this month with a desperate plea for more military aid. In Washington, I'm Amy Morris, Bloomberg Radio.
U.S. and China have been holding talks with reports Russia may have asked for Beijing support to bypass sanctions and to acquire equipment. The State Department's Ned Price says any such cooperation will be dealt with harshly.
We will ensure that no country is able to get away with such a thing.
Ned Price did not elaborate on the U.S. response. The U.S. is confirming no U.S. citizens were at a training facility in Ukraine that came under attack. This happened in western Ukraine over the weekend. The Pentagon's John Kirby says it's unclear what Russia's reasons were for attacking the facility, but he says it wasn't because that was a U.S. aid route.
We have multiple routes to get security assistance into the hands of the Ukrainians. This was not one of them.
Again, the Pentagon's John Kirby. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons.
All right, Nance, thank you so much. Carol Master along with Tim Stanovic, and we did get Vail Resorts, ticker MTN, their results after the closing bell. The stock was initially lower, but right now it looks like it's unchanged.
Yeah, what really grabs my eye, Carol, is this letter to employees from Kirsten Lynch, the new CEO, relatively new CEO, who took over for Rob Katz. She writes just about 100 days ago. If you've been following the Vail Resorts story, you've known that the company has had an incredibly difficult time attracting and retaining talent in its mountain communities around the country, around the United States, I should say. For a few reasons. One is the talent war that's going on. Two, it has to do with immigration, and it's really difficult for people to come into the United States right now who typically are those seasonal workers. And three, the cost of living in these areas and how much it costs. It's very expensive. So today, she says that we're taking some important first steps with incremental annual $175 million investment in our employees, including $20 minimum wage for all employees at all 37 North American mountain resorts. $20 minimum wage. That's big.
And then a $21 per hour minimum for patrol maintenance technicians and certified commercial vehicle drivers.
Yeah, and a Canadian $20 per hour minimum wage at Whistler Blackcomb. That's up from $15.20 Canadian. Guaranteed minimum of $20 per hour for tipped roles as well.
So, and then they talk about a new 40% employee discount at all Vail Resorts retail for the 2022-2023 winter season. It sounds like they are having a tough time getting workers.
Yeah, the company's making a $4 million investment in human resources immediately. It's adding 66 people to the People Connect and payroll teams. It's a 50% increase, almost to central HR services staff. And then this is an interesting one, Carol, given our work shifting discussion in recent weeks. New flexible remote work for our corporate office. When I lived in Vail from 2006 to 2009, it was a big deal when Rob Katz moved headquarters from Vail in the mountains down to Broomfield on the Front Range. So it's based just outside of Boulder, Colorado, but now flexible remote work for even those employees.
This is fascinating. And then it also says, to reflect the changing dynamics in today's labor market, we are doubling our merit increases for year end from an average of 3% to an average of 6% effective October of 2022 for salaried employees. Stock right now is up about 0.4%, but when we talk about wage costs and labor costs, you're seeing it directly for Vail. This is Bloomberg.
updates, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. We're keeping an eye on Coupa Software shares. After hours, they are plunging now by about 25%. Its revenue forecast for the first quarter missed the average analyst estimate. After earnings, Vail Resorts, company we were just talking about, now unchanged. Second quarter net revenue, $906.5 million. Estimates, $956.8 million. Volatility continued to dominate global markets today as investors assess geopolitical developments. Stocks failing to hold on to gains that had reached 1% earlier in the day. The S&P 500 index down 31 points, falling today by 0.7%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average did gain 1 point, little change there. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 262, a drop there of 2%. The NASDAQ 100 Index closing in a bear market today for the first time since March of 2020. 10-year yield 2.14%. Spot gold down 1.9%, $19.51 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude down 6.6%, $102.15 a barrel. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Well, here we are, third year of the global pandemic. And with that in mind, the global communications firm Edelman surveyed some 10,000 individuals in 10 countries. That includes China, Germany, and the U.S. for a special report looking into trust in healthcare.
Richard Edelman is Chief Executive Officer of Edelman. He joins us once again on the phone from New York City. Richard, great to have you back with us. How are you?
Thanks. Really great. And, for me, for the two of you, the most important thing is the pandemic really reduced people's confidence in the healthcare system. And they really find it difficult to get medical advice that's not politicized. And that has a huge consequence on their behavior because low trust individuals actually have much less likelihood of getting vaccinated or even going for checkups regularly.
Well, what can you tell us about where this mistrust comes from? And I'm a little worried about where it comes from. I mean, I imagine a lot of it comes from the messaging.
Some part of it comes from politics, meaning Republicans are less than Democrats, trusting. Some part of it comes from race. Blacks and Hispanics are less trusting than white. Some part of it, you'll be surprised, actually urban people are, more trusting than rural. And the problem is internet searches is the number one source of information for the unvaccinated, not experts. And it just means that you get urban myths passed around.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have members of my family in the medical community, and it's like you got to be careful about Dr. Google because, you all of a sudden think you have something, and then you walk into a doctor's office, and this is what you say you have, and, you've got to really rely on the experts and the science, whether it's the pandemic or anything else that's out there. It is interesting.
But Carol, on that point,
yeah.
2/3 of people say that there's a gap between how well they take care of their health and how well it should be taken care of. So they're self-aware. But information is equal to cost in driving that gap. In other words, in America, under half the people say they consume health information once a week, which is crazy. And how do they fill it? Well, as you say, they go online or they just rely on themselves, which is spooky.
Which is interesting. I was thinking about having done a couple of virtual doctor visits and was pretty skeptical running into it or going into it. I realized actually how great it can be if you're busy or, the access it can give you. It's not perfect and it won't work for everything. There's nothing like face-to-face. But I do wonder, I think we thought to some extent that this would be a great game changer. What's the thought on technology in medicine and access?
What we found is that the most trusted source for people who are basically distrusting is my doctor or a pharmacist, people close to them. And also, Carol, employers. And that's really important for the listeners of this show because they're the leading believable source of health information. So my employer is critical.
Wow. So what's the recommendation when you take all this together, Richard? What are the takeaways as to change this?
We have to break through this information barrier.
But should it be employers who are the ones who do this? Because not everybody trusts their employer.
Here's the thing. We have to build trust in the health ecosystem. We have low trust in government right now, and therefore it's on my employer. And it's on my employer influencing good health choices, giving reliable information, giving people incentives to their health. And we have to also address the disparities in health outcomes. People in lower income neighborhoods, et cetera, they have a 2-to-1 worse outcome for COVID, partly because they're frontline workers and also partly because they don't have equal access to docs.
Well, it's interesting. I was thinking about the work shifting summit that we did last week for Bloomberg Live, and I've talked with Fran Kosudis over at Cisco, Chief People Policy and Purpose Officer. She's a senior, executive VP there, and so in the C-suite, the mental well-being has certainly been something that companies, certainly at Cisco and elsewhere, that they are taking seriously and understand their role in it. Hey, Richard, before we go, just got about a minute or so left. We'd be remiss if we didn't ask you. You talk to the global corporate community on a regular basis. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, what does it mean longer term? Are companies going to step away from Russia as they need to, as required by sanctions, but also stay away longer term?
I think that they're being pushed by their employees and by their consumers to say we're out. And 350 companies have made that choice. And the obvious ones were the energy companies that were in joint ventures with Russian state-owned companies. But then it became the tech companies and financial services, and then more recently, people in QSR restaurants. And so this is as dramatic a move by companies that I can remember since South African sanctions in the 70s and 80s during apartheid.
Is it permanent?
I think it is certainly permanent given the state of affairs in the current government in Russia.
Yeah, I mean, I have a hard time seeing how some of these companies can say, wait a second, okay, Putin, whatever happens next, we're going to go back in, whatever that looks like and whatever, how long that takes.
Well, especially if this war goes on for another couple of weeks and, Kiev gets destroyed and there are, thousands of casualties and 5 million people who've had to immigrate. It has all the aspects of a complete mess, and companies don't want to be part of a mess.
All right. Thank you so much. Richard, be well. Richard Edelman, Chief Executive Officer at Edelman, on the phone in New York City, out with their latest trust barometer here in 2022, a special report, Trust in Healthcare, really looking at that issue specifically. All right. You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week. Next up, Silicon Valley and Russia. What does that mean? We'll tell you.
Broadcasting live from the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio in New York. Bloomberg 1130 to Washington, D.C. Bloomberg 99.1 to Boston. Bloomberg 106.1 to San Francisco. Bloomberg 960 to the country. Sirius XM Channel 119. And around the globe, the Bloomberg Business app and BloombergRadio.com. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
You are listening to Bloomberg Business Week on this Monday. Carol Massar along with Tim Stenovec. And coming up, we're going to talk about Silicon Valley, what it is doing to try and disentangle itself from Russian money.
Jackie Davalos, technology reporter for Bloomberg News, has a new story out on the Bloomberg terminal. We're going to get to it in just a few minutes. First, though, let's get a check of everything happening after hours and how this trade ended up. Here's Charlie Pellet.
Hey, thank you very much. First of all, how we ended up. It was a losing day, Tim Stenovec, for the Dow. Actually, for the S&P and NASDAQ. The Dow, choppy session, but it managed to eke out a 1-point gain today. S&P down 31, drop there of 7 tenths. NASDAQ down 262, lower by 2%. 10-year yield 2.13%. Gold down 1.7%, 19.53 the ounce. Oil, a major story today. 102.12 is where West Texas Intermediate crude now stands, lower today by 6.6%. Brent down 5.9%, 106.06 for a barrel of Brent. So what was driving today's trading? Sarah Ponzik is Senior Wealth Strategy Associate at UBS Private Wealth Management, and she was our guest right here on Bloomberg Business Week.
You see the NASDAQ, for example, back in a bear market, down more than 20%. We see tech stocks and high valuation companies really taking the brunt of the selling.
And today we had the NASDAQ 100 closing in a bear market for the first time since March of 2020. Earnings after the bell today. Coupa Software's revenue forecast for the first quarter missed the average analyst estimate. Shares are plunging now by about 26%. We also heard from Vail Resorts. Second quarter net revenue, $906.5 million. Estimates, $956.8 million, now down by about 2.7%. Vail, by the way, hiking its dividend, also increasing its minimum wage to $20 an hour. Recapping 10-year yield, 2.13%. S&P today down 0.7%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It is indeed. Charlie, thank you. Well, follow the money. That is something we are doing from many angles when it comes to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That includes a story on what Silicon Valley is doing as it tries to distance itself, disentangle itself from Russian money. It's not so easy, though.
It's not easy, as Jackie Davalos explains. And one of her most recent pieces, she's technology reporter for Bloomberg News. She joins us on the phone from New York City. Her piece, along with Ivan Livingston and Sarah McBride, Silicon Valley tries to disentangle itself from Russian money. Jackie, to what extent does Russian money is Russian money supporting startups in Silicon Valley right now?
That is a difficult question to answer, but it was something that we wanted to at least get to a little bit of to the bottom of, because it is not an easy task to even trace where this money is coming from. Even after the annexation of Crimea, which in turn led to an exodus of Russian entrepreneurs and more scrutiny around Russia-tied capital, you still have oligarch-backed family offices, holdings companies, other offshore investment vehicles that have made it easy for these ties to go under the radar. So what we do know for sure is that there's been about $9 billion over the last year in Russian capital into startups. That number has only grown over the past 4 years since a lot of this scrutiny around Russia ties has intensified. Looking forward to today, legal experts tell us that, because there's a varying level of restrictions depending on the type of sanctions, it's hard to say what exactly is going to happen to those that have exposure.
And Jackie, how do you pull the money back from startups that, have either put the money to work? I mean, it's not so easy.
No, and it really does start with the venture capital firms that disperse this money to the startups, which is why we were focusing on some of the biggest firms out there. You look at RTP Global, which was started by an oligarch, effectively, that was placed on the treasury lists list of Putin allies back in 2018, that relationship is starting to come under scrutiny. You have DSM, you have Fort Ross, another one that we profiled. They have a hard time now, difficult decisions to make. What happens to not just the startups, but also the other limited partners, the other investors in the firm, because a lot of that capital is subject to being frozen, especially if you are on the sanctions list that is the most restrictive. And so for startups, they are shielded a little bit because there is enough funds to kind of, be able to spread it across and other LPs to keep it afloat. But these sanctions are only going to increase scrutiny.
I want to talk a little bit about Yuri Milner, who people have been following technology and Facebook for years. It's a familiar name to them. A Russian-Israeli billionaire. DST Global is the firm that he's behind. Used to be Digital Sky Technologies, but an investor in Facebook, Twitter, Alibaba. What do we need to know about Milner?
There is a lot. He was recently slapped with, well, in the past has come under more scrutiny around his ties to Putin. And regarding Yuri, there has been much more the legitimization of his investments, which yield much more credibility. However, what we should know is that even Yuri Milner's ties are coming under much more scrutiny, which then, for the startups and the VCs that are taking this money, it's about the reputational impact. And that's what legal experts are telling us, that this is something that they need to assess regardless if these ties look legitimate, because there is so much more kind of under the surface that still needs to be uncovered.
I mean, what's tricky, Jackie, right, is the transparency or really understanding maybe for some of these venture capital funds where the money is coming from. You talked about this earlier, and I would imagine, or is there kind of a little bit of a panic underway in Silicon Valley to make sure they're legit because of, or they're careful about what money they've got because of the sanctions that have been imposed?
Absolutely. And one of the big loopholes right now is that VC investors are not obligated to disclose who their limited partners, who their investors are. And these KYC, as they call it, know your client best practices, are going to see a revamp. Experts tell us that this is something that is really unprecedented, and there hasn't been this level of attention because for so long, Silicon Valley was almost this place where you could go and anyone could invest, especially after, Putin came into power and that exodus in investments, under the guise of legitimate entities, was able to open the door to that. And so all of those practices are now going to really be reassessed because no one is clean from these ties, it's looking like.
Jackie, very briefly, 20 seconds. Do startups that have money like this, do they give it back? What happens?
It's not that simple. However, we haven't seen any that are just giving money back, neither from the VC end as well. But what we do know is that if they are sanctioned individuals, that money will be frozen and we'll have to find that capital elsewhere.
All right. Well, great check-in with you. Jackie Davalos, she's tech reporter here at Bloomberg News on the phone in New York City.
Well, let's head to Washington, D.C. for a check of the latest world and national news. Nancy Lyons is standing by. Hey there, Nance.
Thanks, Tim. President Biden is considering a trip to Europe to talk with leaders within the NATO alliance. Bloomberg's Washington correspondent Anne-Marie Hordern with the purpose of
this
the
is
trip.
to make sure that the White House is standing alongside its European partners like Germany, those on the eastern flank, and to make sure that they are talking tough and showing that NATO is united and they have this resolve to be united in the face of Vladimir Putin.
Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern says the U.S. and China are also having discussions. China has failed to repudiate Russia for its invasion, and the U.S. wants assurances it will not help Russia circumvent international sanctions. Republican Senator Pat Toomey tells Bloomberg any cooperation between Moscow and Beijing would be a major miscalculation.
It's not clear that China has decided to actively support Russia. It would be a huge mistake for China to do that. I'd be shocked if they would go any further than they already have, which is to sort of provide moral and a little bit of political sort of support. But the idea of providing military aid would be madness for China.
Senator Toomey says China's economy is tied to the West. He doubts its leaders want to put that at risk. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and First Lady Dr. Jill Biden today paid tribute to the International Women of Courage. Secretary Blinken mentioned the importance of gender equity during today's virtual awards ceremony.
We have to address gender inequities that often relegate women to the sidelines and combat the violence that women and girls around the world endure every single day.
Blinken says they're incorporating women's rights throughout the administration's foreign policy. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
All right, Nance, thank you so much. Carol Massar, along with Tim Stanovic, here on the Monday edition of Bloomberg Business Week from Bloomberg headquarters in New York City, our interactive broker studio. I'm just going to say, when we were on the West Coast ahead of the Super Bowl, we had a former teammate of, totally bad to Kane, of Tom Brady, and he talked about, like, not necessarily ruling out Brady being back in the game.
But there's something like...
I'm just saying, we had it.
Okay, there's something to be said about, taking a couple seasons off, not a couple months off, right? There was some, So Carol, this news hit
Just want to know what the deal is.
last evening, and I'm thinking to myself, what changed his mind?
I don't know.
What changed his mind? Does the control room know? Do they have any ideas? Because we got
Paul
some
Brennan, is it because he wants
serious
to
Tom
go
Brady
out
fans in
on
there.
winning another Super Bowl? I got nothing from Paul. All right, well, anyway, Tom Brady says he's coming back for a 23rd season in the NFL after previously saying he was retiring. Here's the quote: "These past 2 months, I've realized my place is still on the field and not in the stands. That time will come, but it's not now." He put that out in a tweet. He's 44 years old, although many would argue the shape he is in and how he takes care of himself makes him a lot younger.
Yeah, he did call it a career about, way, way, way long ago, 6 weeks ago, Carol. You remember that Instagram post, right? He said that he had unfinished business, though, and would be returning to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. 23 seasons in the NFL. This will be his 23rd.
Yeah, Tampa Bay Buccaneers general manager saying Tom is the greatest quarterback of all time who is still playing at an elite level. He's accumulated 7 Super Bowl championships, 3 MVPs, and 5 Super Bowl MVPs.
What do you think? Were you? I mean, yes, Tully told us that don't rule it out, but I'm thinking, okay, maybe a couple seasons of sitting on the sidelines, but
this is someone
what's
who's
great. Maybe he's like he didn't get out of shape, right? Because it's just a typical off season, I imagine. So it's not like he has to go through some, crazy process of getting back in shape after being on the sidelines for a couple of years.
I think many would argue he's still at the top of his game or near it. And so I just personally think he wants to go out on a win, another Super Bowl win. So time will tell. Anyway, interesting. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Stocks dropped with the NASDAQ 100 down 20% from a record. Today, the NASDAQ 100 index was down by 1.9%. Fed traders, meanwhile, are moving to price in 7 standard rate hikes for 2022. Volatility continued to dominate global markets today as investors assessed geopolitical developments. U.S. stocks failed to hold on to gains that reached 1% earlier in the session. S&P down 31, a drop of 0.7%. The Dow up 1 point today, eking out a gain. We had NASDAQ down 262 with a drop of 2%. 10-year yield 2.13%. Gold down 1.8%, $19.52 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude was down 6.7%, $102.03 a barrel on WTI. Wells Fargo is raising CEO Charlie Scharf's pay 20% for 2021, a year in which profit recovered and shares advanced more than most of the bank's rivals. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thanks so much. Well, leadership, we talk about it a lot, definitely changing as a result of the pandemic and just so many racism and inequities in our world. We talked about it a lot last week at Bloomberg's Work Shifting Summit. And Tim, our next guest has identified and profiled 168 of the greatest coaches and managers of all time, what they can teach us about optimizing our performance, our character, and our lives.
It's all collected in the book Coach, The Greatest Teachers in Sports and Their Lessons for All of Us. It's by Justin Speisman, who joins us on the phone from Atlanta. Justin, how are you?
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me. I'm great.
Good. Well, thanks for joining us. For people who perhaps are not into sports as much as you are, I think there's still a lot that coaches can offer us. And I'm wondering what it is about coaches when it comes to leadership, when it comes to the way that they think about personal development, that has lessons for everyone.
Yeah, I think you stated two things that are true. Few people are into sports as much as I am, number one. And number two, in many ways, coaches are our first great teachers. I can remember when I was a child on the soccer field, on the basketball court, my coaches were teaching me not just about the sport, but life lessons, teamwork, communication, giving it your all, not quitting, dealing with adversity, recovering from wins or recovering from losses, showing humility in wins. These are all lessons that will serve us all later in life. And the beauty of this book is it really does transcend not just sports, but also business, because so many of these lessons that these wonderful coaches give to us are easily used across business, across marriages, across teams, across nearly every aspect of life.
It's like a book of short stories, sports short stories, which is really cool. And as I mentioned, it's almost 170 of coaches and managers within all walks of the world of sports, folks that aren't with us anymore. It's just fascinating. Give us, as you did this, is there a favorite or a couple of favorite ones that you profiled and kind of the key lessons that we can learn from them that stand out?
Yeah, so that's a really tough question. In some ways, it's like asking you which of your children are your favorites. And the short answer is, I thought that so many of these particular coaches were so wonderful in their own life with not just what they accomplished. I mean, they're all accomplished. They won the games, they got the titles, they changed the lives. But when you start to look at the stories within the stories, there were so many remarkable ones. I mean, just flipping through the book, it's so easy. George Halas, right? He was a coach of the Chicago Bears. Nobody who ever gave his best regretted it. Don't do anything in practice that you wouldn't do in the game. Find out what the other team wants to do. Then take it away from them. I mean, these are just impactful lessons that can make a humongous difference in our own lives. And so what stuck out to me that was some of the coolest parts of the book, and I kind of took this unbiased approach. Like, I didn't know who the best coaches were going to be until I did the research. I didn't.
Well, how did you determine? How did you determine like the best? That seems a little subjective, but how did you figure it out?
Yeah, it's very subjective. That's why I had to have 168 of them, because I couldn't figure it all out.
Did you have to remove? I mean, did any not make the cut?
It's actually funny. I did about 130 and I was done. I thought I was done. And then the publisher said, how about 30 more? And so we actually expanded the list because there were a lot on the cutting board that I'm like, I just don't know. Like, I don't know how to choose this one over that one. And so we actually added.
I do wonder, too, as you go through this, as I said, a lot of these, I don't know if all of them, forgive me that I don't know that, but a lot of them are not, some of them are still alive, but a lot of them aren't. Is there a coach that's not with us now that you think would be a great coach to have us at this time when there's a lot going on in the sports world? There's a lot being asked of athletes. There's a lot that athletes are able to demand that they couldn't maybe 50 years ago or 40 years ago or even 30 years ago.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a number of them. One that stands out in my mind is Dean Smith, University of North Carolina basketball coach who we lost in 2015. One of his great quotes was, if you treat every situation as a life and death matter, you'll die a lot of times. He goes on to say, at the end of the day, it's just a game. Value what's important, always acting with honor and integrity. And I think if we take that approach to life, there's going to be a big difference in how people feel about how they're being treated. And obviously, marginalized folks and people that aren't getting equal treatment will get a little bit more of a fair shake at things if we treat each other with dignity and respect.
What makes a good coach, Justin? What's the common thread that runs through every one of these stories?
Well, as you know, and as you would imagine, winning is important, but there's a lot of good coaches that never won. And so what I think makes a good coach is an individual that has the ability to bring, and at least in team sports, a number of people that are fundamentally different in terms of background, life experiences, and teach them how to be one, right? How to create synergy amongst a number of people that are very different and that aren't always like that particular coach. So I think that's one of the most important things, is bringing people together to accomplish a aligned goal.
Justin, one thing I think some might find controversial, perhaps not, is Earl Woods, the father of Tiger Woods. And no doubt about it, the incredible athlete that is Tiger. But I think as more and more information has come about, and I think in general, when we look at sports, we're looking at coaches that were revered only to see them come undone because of how they were with their athletes. And I'm not necessarily saying Tiger's father generally, but gymnastics and other sports where there were incredible injustices. Earl Woods is in the book. How come?
Because he was a fundamentally great coach, in my opinion. And I think you touched on gymnastics, the Karolyi's, right? There's tons of stuff about them and about whether they were too hard on their athletes and about whether they gave their athletes dignity and cared for them, or if they just looked at them as like a conduit for success in their own lives. And so one of the things that was important to me as a writer, and kind of taking a journalistic view on this type of book, was that I can't judge the character of the person, although that does inscribe you in the book of great coaching to some degree. But there's a lot of coaches like Bobby Knight that most people will say is a pretty conflicted figure, but a great coach. So does he belong? Does he not belong? I guess that's a debate for the reader.
Justin, we only have 30 seconds left, but after doing all of this research into these great coaches, what's one change that you've made to the way that you live your life as a result?
Wonderful question. I'm a lot more conscious about how the things I say and the things that I do affect others around me.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
Actually, and really timely. Hey, Justin, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Justin Spiesman, he is author and sports writer. His new book is called Coach, The Greatest Teachers in Sports and Their Lessons for Us All. As I said, it's like a bunch of sports short stories in terms of the coaches that are out there. All right, Monday done. Tomorrow's Tuesday. Wednesday, we get the Fed meeting.
Oh, that old thing?
That old thing.
A rate hike?
We know that's coming. It's just what else the Fed gives us and says. All right, everybody, Monday over. Have a safe evening.